Good evening, everybody, and thanks for coming along. I can certainly attest to how cold and wintry it is out there. I spent an hour between 5 and 6 o'clock at my son's football training down in Hampton, which was extraordinarily cold and wet. There was a good example of psychological resilience, though. They had a couple of, it was meant to be pie night, and they were going to have training, then they were going to go into the club rooms and have meat pies and soft drinks, and all the kids were really, really excited. They had all the squads training together. And a couple of Collingwood football players turned up. There was a friend of the friend, knew them, and so a couple of the really popular players turned up to training, and the kids were so excited. My son and a couple of his friends all happened to be Collingwood supporters, so they were all really excited. And at the end of training, they all rush off to the club rooms, and they're going to meet the players and get photos taken and get autographs and have their pies. And as it turns out, there's a blackout, and the club rooms are completely dark. Then there are no pies. The pies are completely cold, and so we have 67 and 8-year-old children in a dark football club rooms, running around screaming. It was just absolute mayhem. They managed to ask the players a few questions, but then they had to kind of get their cold pie and their drink and go home. And we get in the car to go home, and my son says, "Well, Dad, we didn't get to have a pie night, but at least we got to have a magpie night." And I thought that was kind of good. That was a good example of sort of psychological resilience. Anyway, I'll get on with talking about something a little bit different to that now. I gather this is meant to change the slides, but maybe not. Can we maybe ask Erica? Where's Erica hiding? Do you mind just every time I glance. So I might as well get it moving. Yep. Okay, so I want to talk just a little bit generally about schizophrenia to kind of put some of the stuff that I'm going to talk about in context. I want to talk sort of a bit generally about sort of the state of play with developments of treatments for schizophrenia, and then talk in a little bit more detail about some of the activities that we've been involved in at the Alfred, and we've been doing trials for a number of years of different sorts of treatments, and I want to sort of spend a bit of time talking about those in some detail. So you all know that schizophrenia is unfortunately a very common disorder. It affects around 1.5% of our population, and it's characterised by a variety of different symptoms. There are the so-called positive symptoms of schizophrenia, which aren't positive in any way, shape or form. I think it's a terrible sort of naming scheme, and they include the hearing voices and the false beliefs that people can get and the confused thoughts. And these generally have tended to be the target of the development of most treatments to date. Because of these symptoms lead people to come to hospital. They're the sorts of things that people talk about that are really obvious. Most of treatment development has focused on the treatment of these symptoms. And generally speaking, the treatments that we have for schizophrenia are not treatments of schizophrenia, they are treatments of positive symptoms. The so-called antipsychotic medications treat psychotic symptoms. They don't treat schizophrenia per se. And that's kind of important in thinking about what we need to do in developing new treatments. Because if we can only treat one of the symptoms of schizophrenia, we need to be able to do much better than that. It's also worth mentioning right from the start that most researchers into schizophrenia now pretty much accept that it's unlikely that schizophrenia is a single condition. It's highly likely that there are a number of different underlying causes for schizophrenia, and that the types of symptoms that patients express are a bit like the issues with heart disease. There are lots of things that can cause heart disease, but essentially patients only experience one or two different sorts of symptoms. They get pain in their chest, or they get shortness of breath, but then there are a whole range of different underlying causes for that sort of heart problem. And most people are moving away from trying to understand the single cause for schizophrenia, but to understand the causes of schizophrenia. And then ultimately, the implication of that is that there's unlikely to be one curative treatment. It's likely to be that there'll be different types of treatments for different types of schizophrenia. And I think that shift has been a really important one, because the quest, for example, to find the gene for schizophrenia has consumed researchers for many, many years and has proved completely fruitless. we really haven't got anywhere with that sort of approach. But if we try to understand the causes underlying individual types of schizophrenia or even individual symptoms, it seems to be giving us a much more potent way of understanding the illness. Go ahead. So these positive symptoms that I talk about are generally, traditionally being believed to be related to changes in the activity of one of the neurotransmitters in the brain. So this is one of the chemicals that the nerve cells in our brain use to talk to one another. And it's been traditionally believed that there was too much of this neurotransmitter, and so that the drugs that we use to treat schizophrenia, the antipsychotic medications, tend to block some of the receptors or reduce the activity of this particular chemical in the brain. And this is a little diagram showing how the neurotransmitter dopamine gets released from one nerve cell and it binds to the receptor on the other side, and that process can be blocked by the medication that we take. And this shows you where these so-called dopamine nerve cells are actually in our brain. They actually come from very small areas at the base of our brain, but the nerve cells pass quite widely throughout the brain, and they influence a whole range of the things that we do and feel, our capacity to sort of think in complex ways, and also our emotions. So medications that affect this system in our brain can have fairly widespread effects. These symptoms, as I said before, are the things that the medications treat most effectively. About 70% of patients who have these so-called positive symptoms will get better with the traditional medications that we use. However, 70% is clearly not good enough. And there's really a pressing need to develop other treatments that fill that particular gap. The other really major class of symptoms for patients that the patients who have schizophrenia experience are the so-called negative symptoms. And these are essentially an absence of something, an absence of drive, an absence of energy, and particularly an absence of a capacity to experience pleasure. And these sorts of symptoms tend to develop very slowly. They're much more insidious. They're far less noticeable. But ultimately, they are very troublesome, and they tend to contribute actually more to disability and the inability of patients to get back to work, to experience quality of life and well-being than even the positive symptoms. Because for two reasons. One, because they are so insidious, and if you haven't got drive and motivation, you're not going to go and engage in rehabilitation or the other sorts of programs you want to engage in. But also because the treatments we have just are not nearly good enough for the treatment of these negative symptoms. We understand the brain mechanisms underlying these symptoms far less, and the treatments aren't really specific to the treatment of them. We do know, however, that there are particular things going on in the brains of patients with schizophrenia when they have negative symptoms. And that's sort of is shown here. The front, it doesn't come out very well on this particular slide, but the front part of the brain of patients who have particularly problematic negative symptoms isn't lighting up. It isn't as active as it would be under normal circumstances. And this seems to underlie that lack of drive, that lack of motivation, and also that lack of capacity to experience pleasure that patients can experience. There are some other symptoms that don't get discussed as much as well that are particularly important in the outcomes of people with schizophrenia. Some patients experience some really subtle and often not noticeable but really problematic changes in their thinking. The patients with schizophrenia don't have a global decrease in their IQ. It's not an intellectual disability by any means, but there are sometimes subtle impairments in problems with memory and concentration that really, again, cause problems during, say, rehabilitation, affect people's capacity to get back into employment, and so forth. And these have really been ignored until very recently as the target of symptoms, because we didn't have good ways of measuring them, we didn't understand them well, and so it was very difficult to go out and develop specific treatments aimed at cognitive symptoms. I'm not going to talk about these much more tonight, but I just want to acknowledge that there has been a very significant recognition of the importance of these symptoms in recent years. The National Institute of Mental Health, which is the major US-based research organisation that funds mental health research, has made a really concerted effort to develop tools that will enable researchers to actually make progress in this area. So they went ahead and developed a standard set of tests for measuring the sorts of thinking problems that people with schizophrenia experience, so that we can actually conduct studies, so that no matter what studies are being done around the world into this area, people are using the same set of tools, so people can share their results, that companies can go ahead and develop new drugs for treatment of this area, and they've got the tools to enable those trials to happen. So it's relatively early days, but there's a real sense now that there's a road forward for targeting these particular symptoms as something that needs to be actively treated.